I'm Shira, and I'm here to talk to you about Harchakot. Harchakot is not everyone's favorite topic. Sometimes when people think of Harchakot, they think of being annoyed or they think of being stressed. Sometimes people can feel that Harchakot are adding a sort of tension or a sense of stress on top of an already stressful time for a couple. And so I want to try to reframe what Harchakot are and try to suggest ways that keeping Harchakot can potentially be easier for couples. So I'll start by bringing in a Gemara from Masechet Eruvin, which quotes Rav as saying that if there's a situation in which a husband and wife are sleeping together in the same room, and there's a third person who enters the room and stays with them, that is not a positive situation, and we want to try to avoid a third person sleeping in the same room as a husband and wife. The Gemara states that this is true even when the wife is nida, that even when a couple is in the nida state, we still don't want somebody else to be sleeping in the same room as them. And Rav Yonatan Cohen Milumiel states beautifully that the reason for this is because there are certain private, emotionally intimate conversations that need to take place between husband and wife, even when she's a nida, that wouldn't be able to take place if there's somebody else in the room with them. And he says so beautifully that this is a painful experience for them to not be able to share those private, intimate conversations. And so what we learn from this is that keeping Harchakot during nida is not something that's supposed to distance the couple emotionally from each other. Yes, there is physical separation, but we're aiming for physical separation without emotional distance. I also want to point out a source from the Rush when he explains why we have Harchakot and notes that because we don't have an Isser Yichud between a husband and wife, we don't tell a husband and wife that they can't be together alone while she's in nida, because that would be impossible for the couple to keep. In order to create a situation in which the couple is conscious of the wife's nida status, we create these Harchakot. They serve as fences for the couple in different areas, and the purpose of them is so there's a level of consciousness, a level of awareness of the wife's status. And the language that he uses is sheyizkor et niduta, that they remember her status, that they remember that she's a nida. Some of the Harchakot are there because we view it as a slippery slope. We want to make sure that we avoid sex during nida because it's an Isser Kari, and that's a real Isser that we want to avoid. But the rabbis aren't saying that every single one of the Harchakot is something that we think will cause the couple to jump into bed together. That's not what they're saying. It's just that we want there to be certain reminders, a certain level of consciousness throughout their interactions that just reminds them that she's a nida. Sometimes couples will get frustrated and say, just because I'm passing the salt to my husband doesn't mean we're going to jump into bed together. And just because we are doing something else that is our Harchakot, that doesn't mean that we're going to jump into bed together. And the rabbis agree. It's not necessarily that all Harchakot are there because it's a slippery slope. Some of them are, and some of them are just there to serve as a reminder. So even with this framing of having reminders there throughout interactions that can allow a couple to have a certain awareness, a certain consciousness of her status, but we don't want it to detract from their relationship, even knowing that in theory, that's an ideal, but that can be really hard. And sometimes when we can't interact with each other physically, we can't have that same physically intimate, close connection with our spouse, it can feel like we're swimming against the tide. And sometimes couples will feel that the time of physical separation is something that very naturally makes them pull apart from each other, both physically, but also emotionally. Some ways that I like to advise couples to prevent themselves from pulling away from each other emotionally during the time of separation is to look into something called the 5 love languages. The 5 love languages allow individuals to figure out the way that they have a need to receive love and the way that they tend to give love to other people. And couples will often find that they have different love languages. They need to receive love differently, and they have a tendency to give love differently. The 5 love languages are words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, receiving gifts, and physical touch. And often people will fall into one of these 5 categories. Some people may have 2 love languages, and that's fine, that's great. And using this information can be helpful in determining ways to feel connected to each other, ways to make sure that your spouse feels loved, and ways that your spouse can make sure that you feel loved during times of separation. Sometimes people will find that their love language is physical touch, which can present particular challenges during nida, but it's also very informative because that can be validated and that can become a conversation that a couple has, and the couple can make a conscious effort to ensure that the spouse that has the love language of physical touch is receiving love in other ways as well. It's also really important to go on dates and to have time that you spend together that's special between the two of you while you're nida. That can look like going on walks, it can look like doing puzzles together or playing games together, having a nice dinner together. Whatever time you enjoy together, that's what you should do. Sometimes there will be sexual tension, sometimes there will be emotional tension, and often finding ways to diffuse that by spending quality time together can be incredibly helpful for couples. And lastly, I just want to validate that keeping Harchakot is really hard. And if keeping Harchakot is really hard for you, then it's an indication that you enjoy being together physically, and that's a good thing. We want couples to enjoy each other's company. We want couples to enjoy being together physically. So if it's hard, that's usually a sign of a healthy relationship. I hope that we can reframe the concept of Harchakot from something that increases tension or raises stress levels for a couple during this time period to something that can also make space for enjoying each other in other ways, and that challenges us to make sure that our spouse always feels loved and that we feel connected to our spouse during all times. Thanks for joining me today.